On a Saturday morning in September of 1996, a construction crew stood at the edge of Miller's Crossing Road in Cedar County, Iowa, staring at an impossible problem. They needed to deliver a 4,200-pound bronze church bell down a narrow country lane that hadn't been widened since 1923, and every piece of modern equipment they owned was too wide to fit. The project manager was a man named Steve Hutchins, 39 years old, owner of Hutchins Construction out of Tipton. Steve ran a professional operation, new trucks, certified crews, insurance for everything. He'd been in business for 12 years and built his reputation on solving problems other contractors walked away from. But this problem was different. The First Presbyterian Church of Miller's Crossing had ordered a new bell to replace the original that had cracked in 1994. The bell was cast in Wisconsin, shipped to Iowa City, and now sat on a flatbed trailer at the intersection of Highway 30 and Miller's Crossing Road. The church itself was 3/4 of a mile down that road, surrounded by 150-year-old oak trees and stone walls that made the lane barely 11 feet wide in places. Steve's plan had been simple: use his 1996 Ford F350 dually to pull a specialized trailer with the bell. The F350 was rated to tow 21,000 pounds. The bell weighed 4,200 pounds. On paper, it was easy, except the F350 was 96 inches wide with its mirrors. Miller's Crossing Road was 132 inches wide at its narrowest point. That left 18 inches of clearance on each side. Theoretically possible, practically insane, especially with a $47,000 bronze bell behind you. Steve tried anyway. He got 200 feet down the road before the passenger side mirror clipped a stone wall. He stopped, backed up, repositioned, tried again, made it 150 feet before he had to stop at a section where oak roots had buckled the pavement and narrowed the road even further. He climbed out of the truck and stood in the middle of Miller's Crossing Road, looking at the trees, the walls, the buckled pavement, and the church steeple visible in the distance. "We need a different approach," he told his crew. They tried a smaller truck, Steve's personal Ram, 1,582 inches wide. It fit better, but didn't have the towing capacity for the bell on the trailer. They tried unhitching the trailer and carrying the bell in the truck bed, but 4,200 pounds exceeded the payload rating and the rear suspension sagged dangerously. They tried a Bobcat skid steer to drag the bell on a wheeled dolly. The Bobcat was narrow enough but moved too slowly and kept getting stuck where the road surface was soft. By noon, Steve Hutchins was out of ideas. The church congregation was gathering to watch. The pastor was asking questions. The bell manufacturer's rep was checking his watch and muttering about delivery deadlines. That's when the 1941 Chevrolet stake bed truck came rattling down Highway 30. Let me tell you about Tom Vickers, because understanding him is the only way to understand what happened next. Tom was 73 years old. He'd been a farmer for 50 years before selling his land in 1992 and semi-retiring to a small acreage outside West Branch. He kept a workshop, took on occasional hauling jobs, and spent most of his time maintaining the truck his father had bought new in April of 1941. The 1941 Chevrolet AK Series stake bed was a working truck from an era when trucks were built for one purpose: work. It had a 216 cubic inch inline-six engine making 90 horsepower, a 4-speed manual transmission with a granny low first gear, a wheelbase of 125 inches, and an overall width of just 72 inches, narrow even by 1941 standards. The truck had wooden stake sides, original steel wheels, and paint that had faded from armory blue to a dusty gray blue. It looked old because it was old, but Tom's father had maintained it religiously, and Tom had continued that tradition for 29 years after his father died in 1967. Tom had been driving past on Highway 30, heading to a farm auction in Durant, when he saw the commotion at Miller's Crossing Road. He pulled over, climbed out, and walked over to where Steve Hutchins stood with his crew. "Morning," Tom said. "Looks like you've got a problem." Steve barely glanced at him. "Road's too narrow for modern trucks." We're trying to figure out a workaround. Tom looked at the F350, then at the road, then at the church steeple in the distance. How much does that bell weigh? 4,200 pounds. And you need to get it 3/4 of a mile. Down that lane? That's the situation. Tom nodded slowly. My truck can do it. Steve turned and looked at Tom for the first time, saw the weathered 73-year-old face, the work boots, the faded overalls, saw the 1941 Chevy idling at the roadside with its wooden stakes and pre-war styling. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but that bell weighs over 2 tons. My truck was built to haul 2 tons of grain. Tom interrupted quietly. Did it for 40 years on my father's farm, still does it when I need it to. Steve looked at the old Chevy again. It was narrow, that was undeniable. Probably narrow enough to fit down Miller's Crossing Road, but the idea of trusting a $47,000 bronze bell to a 55-year-old farm truck seemed insane. The road's not just narrow, Steve said. It's rough. Buckled pavement, soft shoulders, sections where the stone walls close in to barely 11 feet. If you clip a wall or get stuck, we're looking at major damage. I've driven that road 1,000 times, Tom said. Grew up 2 miles from here. I know every rut, every tight spot, every place where the oaks crowd in. My truck will fit where yours won't. Steve's crew foreman, a man named Derek, spoke up. Steve, we've been here 4 hours. We're running out of options. Steve looked at the church congregation, waiting. Looked at the bell manufacturer's rep tapping his pen against his clipboard. Looked at the 1941 Chevy that appeared to have rolled straight out of a history book. If you get stuck, Steve said, or if you damage that bell, then I'll pay for it, Tom said calmly, but I won't get stuck and I won't damage it. Steve made a decision that was half desperation, half curiosity. All right, show me what that museum piece can do. Now let me pause here and explain the engineering behind Tom's confidence, because it matters. A 1941 Chevrolet stake bed was designed in an era when roads were narrow, loads were heavy, and trucks had to navigate conditions that would terrify modern vehicles. The truck was 72 inches wide compared to modern pickups at 80 to 96 inches. That 8 to 24 inches made the difference between fitting and not fitting on Miller's Crossing Road. The 4-speed transmission had a first gear so low, a 7.05 to 1 ratio, that the truck could pull heavy loads at walking speed without straining the engine. Modern trucks had more horsepower, but higher gearing for highway efficiency. Tom's truck sacrificed speed for pulling power. The narrow tires, 6.50-16 bias ply, concentrated weight on smaller contact patches, which actually helped on soft ground by cutting through surface mud to find firm soil underneath. Modern, wide tires floated on soft surfaces and got stuck. The truck weighed 3,400 pounds empty and was rated to carry 4,000 pounds in the bed. The bell weighed 4,200 pounds, slightly over spec, but Tom knew the frame could handle it because his father had routinely overloaded the truck by 500 pounds during harvest season for 30 years without incident. Most importantly, Tom had been driving this truck on narrow Iowa farm lanes since 1967. He knew how to read the road, how to position the wheels, how to use the mirrors to gauge clearance, how to feel when the suspension was taking too much weight. Steve Hutchins had better equipment. Tom Vickers had 55 years of experience with this specific truck on this specific type of road. Tom backed the Chevy up to the bell trailer. The crew unhooked the bell from the heavy-duty trailer and, using a come-along and oak planks, carefully slid it into the Chevy's bed. The truck's rear suspension compressed. The leaf springs groaned. The frame settled, but it held. Tom climbed into the cab, started the inline six, and put the truck in first gear, that deep, crawling gear that turned the rear wheels at a fraction of engine speed. The church congregation, Steve's crew, and about 30 locals who'd gathered to watch all stood in silence as the 1941 Chevy, carrying a 4,200-pound bronze bell, started down Miller's Crossing Road. Let me tell you about that drive, because everyone who was there still talks about it. Tom drove at 4 miles per hour, not because the truck couldn't go faster, but because at 4 miles per hour he could read every inch of the road, position the truck perfectly for every narrow section, and react to any problem before it became critical. At the first tight section, where the stone wall on the right closed in and an oak tree hung low on the left, Tom positioned the truck so close to the wall that Steve Hutchins, watching from behind, was certain the mirror would clip stone. It didn't. Tom had left exactly 3 inches of clearance, just enough. At the buckled pavement section, where Steve's F350 had stopped, Tom shifted the Chevy's weight to the left, keeping the heavily loaded right side on the smoother edge of the road. The truck leaned slightly, but stayed balanced. At the section where tree roots had created a hump in the middle of the road, forcing traffic to one side or the other, Tom shifted into second gear briefly, gave the engine just enough throttle to climb the hump without spinning the rear wheels, then dropped back to first as he descended the other side. He stopped twice to check clearance, once where a fallen branch had narrowed the passage, and once where recent rain had created a soft shoulder that might not support the truck's weight. Both times he studied the situation, made micro adjustments to his line, and continued. At the narrowest point, 11 feet of usable road between a stone wall and a drainage ditch, Tom stopped completely. He climbed out, walked the section on foot, measured with his eyes, studied the angle, then climbed back in and threaded the Chevy through with 4 inches of clearance on each side. The wooden stake sides, which extended slightly beyond the truck's fenders, came within 2 inches of the stone wall. Tom could hear the congregation holding their breath, but the stakes didn't touch, the mirror didn't clip, the drainage ditch didn't catch the wheels. The truck slipped through the gap like thread through a needle's eye. The congregation watching from the church started clapping. First one person, then 5, then 20. By the time Tom cleared the final oak tree and emerged into the gravel parking area, the entire crowd was applauding. Tom drove past the church steps, turned carefully in the limited space, and backed the truck directly beneath the bell tower. He positioned it so precisely that the church's crane operator, who'd been standing ready with a portable hoist, didn't need to reposition anything. The bell was exactly where it needed to be. Tom set the parking brake, shut off the engine, and climbed out. Total distance, 3/4 of a mile. Total time, 23 minutes. Total damage, 0. The church congregation erupted in cheers. People rushed forward to look at the truck, at the bell sitting perfectly in the wooden bed, at the narrow tires and the pre-war engineering that had just accomplished what modern equipment couldn't. Children pointed at the wooden stake sides. Older men walked around the truck, examining the leaf springs, the frame, the inline-6 engine visible through the simple grille. One elderly woman, probably in her 80s, touched the faded paint and said quietly, "My father had a truck just like this. I haven't seen one running in 40 years. Steve Hutchins walked up slowly. He stood looking at the Chevy, at the bell, at Tom Vickers leaning casually against the fender like he'd just delivered a load of groceries. "I don't understand," Steve said. "My F350 has 4 times the horsepower, electronic stability control, 4-wheel drive, computer-managed transmission. How did a truck from 1941 do what it couldn't?" Tom patted the Chevy's hood, his weathered hand resting on metal that had been shaped before Pearl Harbor. "Your truck is built for highways and job sites, wide stance for stability at highway speeds, big tires for towing capacity on pavement. All that width makes it safer and stronger on open roads. But this road isn't open. It's a farm lane from 1923, designed for horse wagons and Model Ts." He paused. "My truck was built in the same era as this road. Same width, same assumptions about what a road looks like. It fits because it was designed for a world where roads were narrow and loads were heavy, and you didn't have a choice but to make it work." Steve shook his head slowly. "I spent $32,000 on that F350. I've got every modern feature Ford makes. Tow/haul mode, trailer brake controller, backup camera, the works. And it couldn't do what you're—" He gestured at the Chevy, searching for words. "What my 55-year-old farm truck could do," Tom finished. "I know. My father bought this truck new in 1941 for $645. He drove it until 1967. I've driven it ever since. Never failed me once." Derek, Steve's foreman, spoke up. Mr. Vickers, I've been in construction for 18 years. I've never seen anything like that. The way you position that truck through those tight sections, the way you read the road, the precision, that was masterful. Tom smiled slightly. I've been driving this truck on roads like this since before you were born, son. When you spend 50 years with the same piece of equipment, you learn what it can do. You learn to trust it, and it learns to trust you. What do I owe you? Steve asked. Whatever you think is fair. Steve thought about the 4 hours he'd wasted. The crew time at $40 per hour per man. 4 men, $640 in labor, with nothing to show for it. The risk to his reputation if he'd had to admit he couldn't deliver the bell. The potential penalty fees from the church contract. $500. Tom shook his head. Too much. This was a 23-minute drive. 100 is plenty. Mr. Vickers, you saved this job. You saved my reputation. You did something my equipment couldn't do. 500 is what it's worth? Tom looked at him for a long moment. Split the difference. 250 for me, 250 to the church building fund. Pastor mentioned they're trying to fix the roof. Steve agreed immediately. He wrote 2 checks, one to Tom, one to the church. The pastor accepted his with tears in his eyes. The roof fund just reached its goal, he said. We've been trying for 2 years. Let me tell you what happened after, because the story didn't end at the church. The bell installation made the Cedar County Gazette the following week. The story focused on the 1941 Chevy that had succeeded where modern trucks failed. The photograph showed Tom standing beside the truck with the church bell visible in the background, the wooden stake sides clearly visible, the narrow profile that had made the delivery possible. The headline read, 55-year-old truck delivers where modern equipment couldn't. Within a month, Tom got 6 calls from people with narrow road delivery problems. A furniture store in Iowa City needed to deliver a baby grand piano down a historic street in the Longfellow neighborhood where modern delivery trucks couldn't fit. The street was original brick from 1912, lined with maples planted before World War I, barely 12 feet wide. Tom took the job. The Chevy handled it easily. The piano arrived without a scratch. The furniture store owner asked if Tom would be available for future deliveries. Tom said yes. A farmer near West Liberty needed to haul grain from a century-old barn with an access lane too narrow for modern grain trucks. The lane had been built for horse-drawn wagons in 1887 and hadn't been widened since. Modern trucks with dual rear wheels couldn't navigate it without damaging the stone walls on either side. Tom hauled 40 loads of corn in October of 1996, using the same truck his father had used to haul grain in the 1940s and 50s. The farmer paid him $15 per load. Tom made $600, and the farmer saved his harvest. A construction crew working on the restoration of a covered bridge in Johnson County needed to move equipment through the bridge itself. The bridge had an interior width of 10 feet 8 inches, built in 1883 for horse traffic. Modern pickups were too wide. Tom's Chevy was 72 inches, exactly 6 feet, leaving over 4 feet of clearance. Tom made 8 trips through the covered bridge, hauling tools, lumber, and a small cement mixer. The project supervisor, a historical preservation specialist from Des Moines, took photographs of the Chevy inside the bridge. This truck is the same era as the bridge, she said. They're both from a time when America built things to last. Steve Hutchins called Tom in November of 1996 and asked if he could rent the truck for a job in rural Johnson County. A homeowner wanted to build a garage on property accessible only by a lane through a wooded area. The lane was too narrow for Steve's equipment trucks. Tom said yes. They worked together on 3 more projects that winter. Steve paid Tom $200 per day plus fuel. By March of 1997, Tom had earned $2,400 from the Chevy, more money than the truck had earned in the previous 5 years combined. In April of 1997, Steve made Tom an offer. I want to buy your truck. Name your price. She's not for sale, Tom said. I'll pay $15,000. That's more than it's worth as a collector piece. That's what I'd pay for a working tool that solves problems my modern equipment can't. Tom smiled. This truck was my father's last purchase before World War II. He bought it in April of 1941, left for basic training 2 weeks later, spent 4 years in the Pacific with the Marines, Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Okinawa. He told me he thought about this truck every day he was overseas, thought about coming home and driving it again. He paused, his hand resting on the faded paint. When he came home in October of 1945, this truck was the first thing he wanted to see. Not the house, not the farm, the truck. He walked out to the barn, where my mother had kept it covered, started it up, and drove it around the property for an hour. He told me later that was the moment he finally felt like he was really home. Tom looked at Steve. My father drove this truck for 26 years, hauled grain, pulled stumps, moved equipment, helped neighbors. When he died in 1967, I inherited it. I've driven it for 29 years. Same work, same roads, same purpose. It's not about the money, Steve. It's about keeping a promise. What promise? Steve asked. The promise that some things don't get thrown away just because they're old. The promise that if something is built right and maintained right, it'll last. The promise that my father made when he bought this truck, that it would serve our family, and I made when I inherited it, that I'd keep it serving. Steve nodded slowly. I understand, but if you ever change your mind, I won't. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because they matter to the story. Tom Vickers continued to drive the 1941 Chevrolet for jobs that modern trucks couldn't handle. He became known in Cedar County as the man to call when the road was too narrow, the lane too old, the passage too tight for conventional equipment. In 1998, he delivered construction materials to a historic farmhouse being restored near Mechanicsville. The driveway was original limestone from 1875, narrow and winding through mature walnut trees. Tom made 15 trips over 2 weeks. The restoration contractor wrote about it in a trade magazine. The article was titled, "Sometimes Old Tools Are the Right Tools." In 2000, he helped move a small chapel from one property to another. The chapel, built in 1892, needed to travel down county roads and farm lanes too narrow for modern moving equipment. Tom's Chevy served as the lead vehicle, testing clearances and guiding the moving crew. The chapel arrived intact. In 2003, he hauled antique furniture for an estate sale in Solon. The estate was accessed by a lane through woods, built in the 1920s, barely wide enough for Tom's truck. Modern delivery vehicles couldn't reach the house. Tom made the deliveries, earning $400 and the gratitude of the estate executor. In 2006, he was interviewed by a reporter from the Iowa City Press-Citizen for a story about working antique vehicles. The reporter asked why he kept driving a truck that was 65 years old when he could afford something newer. "Because this truck still works," Tom said. "Because it does jobs that new trucks can't do. Because throwing away something that works just to buy something newer makes no sense to me. And because every time I start this engine, I'm keeping a promise to my father." The article ran with a photograph of Tom standing beside the Chevy in front of his workshop. The truck looked exactly as it had in 1996, the same faded blue paint, the same wooden stake sides, the same narrow profile that had carried it through impossible passages for 65 years. In 2008, Steve Hutchins called Tom for advice. Steve's company had won a contract to restore several historic bridges in Cedar County. The access roads were all narrow, built before 1900, designed for horse-drawn equipment. Steve's modern trucks couldn't navigate them safely. "I need to rent your truck," Steve said. "Not just for one job, for the whole project, 6 months, maybe longer." "She's not for rent," Tom said, "but I'll drive her for you. Same as before, day rate plus fuel." They worked together for 8 months. Tom drove the Chevy down lanes that hadn't seen motorized traffic in decades. He hauled tools, materials, small equipment. He tested clearances and guided modern trucks through sections where inches mattered. When the project finished in March of 2009, Steve paid Tom $18,000 for his time. It was the most money Tom had ever earned from the truck. He put it in savings and kept driving. Tom Vickers drove that 1941 Chevrolet until 2018, when he was 95 years old and his doctor finally convinced him to stop driving. Not because the truck had failed, because Tom's reflexes had slowed and his doctor said it wasn't safe anymore. The truck had 287,000 miles on the original engine. The inline six still ran perfectly. The four-speed still shifted smooth. The wooden stake sides had been replaced twice, but the frame, the engine, the transmission, the axles were all original. Tom's grandson, Michael, took over the truck. Michael was 34 years old, a carpenter who'd grown up hearing stories about the Chevy and the jobs it had done. He'd learned to drive it at 16, learned to maintain it at 20, learned to respect it the way his grandfather did. Michael drives it now. He takes it to jobs where modern trucks won't fit, narrow lanes, historic properties, covered bridges, places where width matters more than horsepower. He maintains it the way his great-grandfather did, the way his grandfather did. Oil changes every 2,000 miles. Grease fittings every month. Fix what breaks before it becomes a bigger problem. The 1941 Chevrolet stake bed is still running, still hauling, still fitting down roads that modern trucks can't navigate. Steve Hutchins retired in 2019 after 35 years in construction. Before he left the business, he stopped by Tom's workshop one last time. Tom was there, 96 years old, sitting in a chair watching Michael work on the Chevy's brakes. "I've been thinking about that day in 1996, Steve said. "The day your old Chevy did what my new Ford couldn't. I learned something that day that changed how I approach every job." "What's that?" Tom asked. "I learned that newer isn't always better. I learned that width and power and technology are only advantages if you're using them in the right situation. I learned that a man who knows his equipment will beat a man with better equipment every single time. And I learned that sometimes the solution to a modern problem is a tool from the past that was built for exactly that kind of challenge." Tom smiled. "My father used to say, 'The best tool is the one you know how to use.' That Chevy's been the best tool I ever owned. Not because it's better than what came after, because I know it. Every gear, every squeak, every inch of what it can and can't do. That knowledge is worth more than any amount of horsepower or electronic gadgets." Steve looked at the truck, at Michael working beneath it, at the same wooden stake sides that had cleared stone walls by inches in 1996. "I spent 35 years chasing the newest equipment. Biggest trucks, latest technology, most powerful engines, made good money doing it. But that day, in 1996, a 55-year-old truck taught me that I'd been solving problems the hard way. Sometimes the answer isn't more power. Sometimes it's less width." He paused. "I never forgot that lesson. Changed how I bid jobs, changed what equipment I bought, changed how I trained my crews. That truck, that day, that lesson, it made me a better contractor." Tom nodded. "Glad it helped." "One more thing," Steve said. "I told that story probably 100 times over the years, to other contractors, to equipment dealers, to young guys, just starting out. You know what the reaction always was? 'What?' Half of them didn't believe me. Said a truck from 1941 couldn't do what I described, said I was exaggerating or misremembering, said modern equipment is better in every way, and there's no situation where an old truck would outperform a new one." "What did you tell them?" Tom asked. "I told them to call you. Some of them did. You remember?" Tom smiled. "I remember. Most of them hung up thinking I was crazy. A few hired me. Those few learned the same lesson you did." Steve stood to leave, then turned back. "Thank you, Tom, for that day, for the lesson, for keeping that truck running, for proving that some things are worth preserving." "You're welcome. But I didn't preserve it. I used it. There's a difference. Preservation is about keeping something safe behind glass. Use is about keeping something working, serving, doing the job it was built for. That truck wasn't built to sit in a museum. It was built to work, so I let it work." The 1941 Chevrolet stake bed sits in Michael's workshop today, still running, still working, still carrying loads down narrow roads that were built for a different era. The inline six purrs like it did in 1941, the four-speed shifts smooth, the wooden stake sides, replaced for the third time in 2020, stand proud. Next to the workshop door is a framed photograph from 1996. Tom Vickers standing beside the Chevy at the First Presbyterian Church of Miller's Crossing. the bronze bell visible in the truck bed, the narrow lane visible behind him, the wooden stake sides that made the impossible delivery possible. Below the photograph, a small plaque reads, "Some problems need more power. Some problems need less width. Knowing the difference is what separates a good contractor from a great one." The contractors still say modern trucks are better. The engineers still say old equipment is obsolete. The dealers still say you need the latest model to get the job done. And somewhere in Cedar County, Iowa, an 83-year-old truck with a pre-war engine and wooden stake sides keeps proving them wrong.